My name is Emily. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I was known as the reliable one, the woman who didn't complain, didn't push, didn't take up much space. If you asked the people I worked with back then, they would have said I was steady, agreeable, and easy to manage, maybe even forgettable. And for a long time, I thought that was a compliment. I've always been this kind of person others underestimate quietly, not because I lack ability, but because I don't announce myself. I listen more than I speak. I observe before I act. I don't fight for attention. That calm has often been mistaken for compliance, and my patience confused with a lack of limits. This story isn't dramatic in the way people expect. There's no shouting match, no explosive resignation, no villain monologue. It's about what happens slowly, invisibly, inside a person who keeps telling herself to be grateful, to endure, to wait just a little longer. It's about the cost of staying silent when silence feels safer than change. For years, I stayed at a job that broke me because I was afraid to leave. Afraid of being seen as ungrateful. Afraid of instability. Afraid that the discomfort I knew was somehow better than the uncertainty I didn't. I told myself that fear was practical, that endurance was maturity. I didn't realize how much that fear was quietly taking from me. This is not a revenge story. I'm not here to expose anyone or to dramatize harm. What I want to offer is honesty, the kind that doesn't flatter the storyteller. I made choices that kept me small. I ignored signals that were clear in hindsight. I accepted versions of myself that were easier for others to live with, but harder for me to recognize in the mirror. The emotional journey you're about to hear is subtle. It moves through normalization, self-doubt, rationalization, and eventually clarity. Not the loud kind of clarity that arrives with anger, but the quiet kind that settles when you finally see the pattern as a whole. When you understand that fear cost me more than quitting ever would. If you've ever felt invisible at work, if you've ever told yourself, this is just how it is, or if you've ever stayed somewhere long after it stopped being safe for your sense of self, this story may feel familiar. I'm not offering advice or a blueprint, just a lived experience told without exaggeration, without bitterness, and without pretending I understood everything while it was happening. So let me ask you gently, before we begin, have you ever confused endurance with strength? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that followed my name most often, usually said in passing, usually without looking at me directly. Emily will handle it. Emily is solid. Emily doesn't mind. Dependable is a comfortable label for everyone except the person wearing it. In meetings, I was the one people talked around, not to. My ideas were often absorbed into the room without attribution, repeated later by someone louder, someone more visible. No one did it maliciously. That's the part that made it harder to name. It was just the current of the room, and I had learned how to float quietly in it. I wasn't the youngest, and I wasn't the most senior. I sat in that middle space where expectations are high and recognition is optional. I knew the systems better than most people. I remembered deadlines no one else tracked. I noticed when processes broke before they became emergencies. When something went wrong, I was called in calmly, like a utility. When something went right, it simply disappeared into the background. I didn't resent this, at least not consciously. I told myself that visibility wasn't my goal, that I preferred stability over spotlight, that being underestimated gave me peace. Those explanations felt mature and reasonable. They also protected me from asking harder questions. At work events, I was polite, pleasant, and never central. I listened, I smiled, I asked questions about other people's projects, rarely about my own. When introductions went around the room, others were described with energy, driving growth, leading innovation, bringing bold ideas. Mine was always functional, keeps things running. I nodded along, I made it easier for everyone. What they didn't see was how much of myself I was compressing to fit that role. I edited my tone, I softened my language, I learned which emails would be ignored unless I framed them as favors instead of observations. I learned when to wait an extra day before following up so I wouldn't be seen as demanding. None of this was written anywhere. It was absorbed knowledge, learned through repetition. I told myself this was professionalism. Outside of work, people often described me as calm, grounded, and unshakable. Friends came to me when they needed perspective. Family trusted me with logistics, planning, and responsibility. I carried that same identity into the office without realizing it had a cost. I believed that being low maintenance made me valuable, that not needing much made it easier for me to keep. Fear lived underneath all of this, though I wouldn't have named it that way at the time. It looked like practicality. It sounded like caution. I had grown up watching money come and go unpredictably. I had learned early that stability was something you protected, not questioned. So when discomfort appeared at work, I categorized it as normal stress, something adults endure quietly. I wasn't invisible in the dramatic sense. No one ignored me outright. No one excluded me from meetings or withheld information. It was more subtle. I was present but interchangeable, trusted but not invested in, needed but not seen as someone whose internal experience mattered. And because nothing was overtly wrong, I didn't give myself permission to feel wrong. I became very good at being useful, anticipating needs before they were spoken, at smoothing transitions, catching errors, and absorbing overflow work. When praise came, it was brief and general. When criticism came, it was indirect, wrapped in suggestions about tone, flexibility, attitude. I adjusted without protest. That adjustment became a habit. Looking back, I can see how clearly the role was defined, even if no one ever said it out loud. I was there to support momentum, not create it, to maintain, not disrupt, to stay steady so others could move fast. At the time, I believed this role was neutral, that it didn't touch my sense of self. I was wrong. It was shaping me quietly, teaching me what parts of myself were welcome and which ones should stay folded away. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was who I was to them, and how easy it felt to disappear inside that definition. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was delivered so softly. It blended into the background noise of a normal workday. No raised voices, no public embarrassment, just a moment that passed quickly enough for everyone else and stayed long enough with me. We were in a small meeting room, glass walls, afternoon light flattening everything. I had spent weeks preparing a process update. Not flashy, but necessary. The kind of work that prevents problems rather than solves them after they explode. I spoke carefully, as I always did, choosing words that sounded collaborative instead of corrective. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then my manager nodded, turned slightly, and said, "Okay, let's move on." That was it. No questions, no acknowledgement, not even a polite thank you. The conversation shifted to something else entirely, and my work dissolved into the air as if it had never existed. I remember sitting there, hands folded, face neutral, feeling a small internal pause. Not anger, more like confusion. I told myself I was overthinking it. That's not everything that needs feedback, that silence can mean agreement. A few minutes later, someone else mentioned a problem my proposal had quietly addressed. The manager leaned forward, interested now. "We should think about creating a system for that," he said. I didn't say anything. I could have reminded them gently that this was exactly what I had just presented. But something stopped me. The risk of sounding defensive, the fear of being seen as territorial, the discomfort of disrupting the flow. So I stayed still and let the moment pass. Everyone else did too. After the meeting, no one mentioned it. No one noticed my quiet withdrawal as I gathered my notes. I walked back to my desk and told myself it didn't matter, that this was just how meetings went sometimes, that I was lucky to be trusted with work at all. That's how the first small cut landed, not as pain, but as a question I didn't ask out loud. Over the next few days, I replayed the moment more than I wanted to admit. Not obsessively, but enough to register a shift, a new awareness. I started noticing how often my contributions entered the room and left without a trace, how ideas needed a different voice to become real, how being calm and non-confrontational also meant being easy to overlook. Still, I didn't label it as disrespect. That word felt too strong, too dramatic. I believed disrespect was obvious. Loud interruptions, dismissive comments, clear exclusions. This wasn't that. This was subtle, almost elegant in its deniability. And because it was deniable, I denied it too. I adjusted instead. I refined my presentations, made them shorter, more polished. I anticipated objections that were never voiced. I learned to present solutions as questions, so they wouldn't sound like challenges. I tried to fit my contributions into the rhythm of the room rather than asking the room to slow down. No one asked me to do this. I volunteered the adjustment, thinking it would help. It didn't. What it did was teach me something dangerous, that I could absorb small erasures without consequence, that each one, taken alone, was survivable, that it was easier to smooth over discomfort than to name it. And so the memory of that first moment stayed with me, not because it hurt deeply, but because it marked the beginning of a pattern I hadn't yet accepted. Everyone else forgot it. I didn't. I carried it quietly, filed it away as data rather than emotion. At the time, I thought that was a strength, that remembering without reacting meant I was in control. I didn't realize I was teaching myself to tolerate being diminished in ways that were easy for others to overlook and harder for me to unsee. That was the first small cut, not enough to bleed, just enough to change how I paid attention. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the problem. If something had exploded, if there had been a confrontation, a clear line crossed, I might have reacted differently. Instead, what followed was a slow repetition of moments that were individually easy to excuse and collectively impossible to ignore. But I didn't see the collective yet. I only saw each moment as it came, isolated and manageable. It became normal for my emails to be answered last, if at all. Not ignored entirely, just delayed long enough to signal priority without stating it. When I followed up, I softened my language automatically. Just circling back. No rush. Let me know if this makes sense. I made sure my requests sounded optional, even when they weren't. In meetings, I noticed how often my comments were met with polite nods and immediate redirection. Someone would thank me, then pivot to another voice. It was always smooth, always reasonable. Nothing I could point to and say, this is wrong. And so I kept telling myself that nothing was. I started doing more work in advance, anticipating needs before they were expressed, filling gaps before anyone noticed they existed. I thought this would make my value undeniable. Instead, it made my presence even more seamless, like infrastructure. Necessary, but not worth discussing. When deadlines were met, no one asked how. When systems were held, no one asked who maintained them. When something slipped, I was looped in quietly to fix it. My name appeared on tasks, not on outcomes. I told myself this was just the nature of my role, that some positions are designed to support rather than shine, that not everyone needs recognition to be fulfilled. I believed that wanting acknowledgement was a kind of vanity I had outgrown. But the truth was more uncomfortable. I was afraid that if I asked for more, I would lose what I had. Fear disguised itself as logic. I had benefits, stability, a predictable routine. I reminded myself how many people would be grateful for that. I compared my discomfort to imagined worst scenarios and used those comparisons to invalidate my own experience. When a colleague interrupted me mid-sentence and continued the point as if I hadn't spoken, I told myself he was just enthusiastic. When my manager assigned me work I had already completed, without realizing it, I told myself that communication had just been unclear. When decisions were made without my input on systems I maintained, I told myself leadership had a broader view. Each time I chose the explanation that required the least friction. I didn't talk about this with anyone. Not because it was a secret, but because I didn't trust the story yet. I worried that if I said it out loud, it would sound petty. Or worse, ungrateful. So I kept it internal, convincing myself that self-awareness was enough. Over time, I noticed a change in my body before I noticed it in my thoughts. A tightness before meetings, a careful monitoring of tone, a fatigue that wasn't physical but still heavy. I began to feel like I was constantly calibrating myself to be acceptable. And still I stayed quiet. Part of me believed that this was temporary, that if I just stayed consistent long enough, someone would notice, that there was an unspoken reward for patience. I had grown up believing in delayed gratification, in doing the right thing without needing immediate payoff. I applied that belief here, even as the delay stretched on. Another part of me feared that speaking up would expose how little leverage I had. What if I voiced concerns and nothing changed? What if the silence after that was louder than the one before? It felt safer to manage disappointment privately than to risk public confirmation that my experience didn't matter. So I normalized it. I built routines around being overlooked. I learned how to feel proud of invisible work. I convinced myself that emotional neutrality was professionalism, that adaptation was resilience. I didn't realize I was slowly shrinking my own expectations. By the time I noticed how tired I felt, how muted my internal voice had become, the pattern was already well established. Disrespect didn't arrive as a single event. It arrived as a climate. And like any climate, it shaped me quietly, daily, until I forgot what the weather used to feel like. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was being mature. I didn't see yet that I was participating in my own erasure, one reasonable excuse at a time. There was a moment, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, when I finally understood the role I had been assigned. It wasn't announced. No one sat me down or spelled it out. It revealed itself through repetition, through the kinds of requests that came my way and the ones that didn't, through the assumptions people made about my availability, my flexibility, and my emotional bandwidth. I was the one they came to when something needed to be fixed discreetly. When a process broke, they didn't want attention drawn to it. When a deadline slipped and someone needed help catching up without making noise. My name was passed along in private messages, not in meetings. Emily can take care of this. She's good at this kind of thing. She won't make it a big deal. And they were right. I didn't. I had become the reliable constant in a system that rewarded visibility over consistency. Others were encouraged to experiment, to lead, to stretch. I was encouraged to stabilize, to hold things together, to be the safety net beneath risks I was never invited to take myself. What struck me once I saw it was how little curiosity there was about my ambitions. No one asked where I wanted to go. No one checked whether the work I was doing aligned with my strengths or interests. My value had been defined early, and everything after that reinforced the definition. I didn't push back because the role came with praise, just enough to keep me compliant. Compliments about being easy to work with, about being dependable, about having a good attitude. These were framed as strengths, and I accepted them as such without asking what they cost me. The role also came with an unspoken expectation: emotional containment. I was not to bring discomfort into the room, not to challenge decisions publicly, not to complicate things. My calm demeanor had become part of the system's comfort, and I had been quietly promoted into the position of emotional buffer. When tension arose between departments, I was looped into smooth communication. When someone else dropped the ball, I was asked to help recover it. When leadership needed reassurance that things were under control, they looked to me, not for vision, but for stability. I started to notice how differently others were treated, how mistakes made by louder, more assertive colleagues were framed as learning experiences, while mine, rare as they were treated as anomalies to be corrected quickly and quietly, how assertiveness in others was interpreted as leadership, while in me it risked being seen as friction. Once I saw this, I couldn't unsee it. I realized that I had been rewarded not for my full capacity, but for my restraint, for knowing when not to speak, for absorbing pressure without deflecting it outward. The system worked better when I stayed exactly where I was, doing exactly what I was doing, and I had helped build that system. This realization wasn't angry, it was clarifying. It explained why my growth had plateaued without anyone ever saying no. Why did opportunities pass near me without landing? Why was my work trusted, but my voice was optional? I thought back to the early days, when I had arrived with ideas and energy, when I believed that competence would naturally lead to expansion. Somewhere along the way, I had learned that expansion wasn't invited. It had to be claimed. And I had chosen, again and again, not to claim it. Fear had made that choice feel responsible. Leaving the role I was good at felt risky. Speaking up felt like destabilizing something that paid my bills and justified my presence. So I stayed useful. I stayed invisible. I stayed quiet. Understanding the role didn't immediately change my behavior, but it changed how I interpreted everything that followed. I stopped asking why I am overlooked and started asking what this system needs me to be. The answer was clear, and for the first time I wondered, not angrily but honestly, what it was costing me to keep fulfilling that need. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no revelation was delivered in a meeting, no email that changed everything. It was an ordinary day, structured like all the others, and that's what made the shift so unmistakable once it happened. I was sitting at my desk early, before most people arrived. The office was quiet in that particular way that only exists before the day officially begins. Screens humming, lights half dimmed, the sense that time hasn't started yet. I was reviewing a document I had been maintaining for months, maybe longer. A living system, one that everyone relied on, but no one had ever formally acknowledged as mine. As I scanned through it, I noticed how many layers it had accumulated. Notes I had added to prevent future mistakes. Workarounds for decisions made without my input. Entire processes were built around avoiding problems that would have existed if I hadn't been paying attention. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never allowed before. What happens if I stop? Not dramatically, not in protest, just what happens if I'm no longer here to hold this together? The answer came faster than I expected. Things would slow, errors would surface, confusion would spread, not because anyone was incompetent, but because so much knowledge lived quietly in my head and my systems. Knowledge that had never been transferred because no one had thought to ask, because I had never insisted. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel strangely calm. I saw with a clarity that surprised me that my fear had been misplaced. I had been afraid of being expendable, but I had made myself indispensable in the wrong way. Indispensable to maintenance, not to growth. Essential, but contained. The shift wasn't about anger. It was about perspective. I understood then that staying silent wasn't neutral. It was an active choice, one that protected everyone else from discomfort while quietly eroding me. Later that day, a minor issue came up. The kind I would normally resolve immediately, without comment. Someone asked if I could just take a look at something that technically wasn't mine anymore. I paused before responding. Not long, just long enough to notice the instinct to say yes rise up automatically, the familiar urge to be helpful, to smooth things over, to prove reliability. And then I didn't. I didn't refuse. I didn't confront. I simply asked a clarifying question, one that placed responsibility back where it belonged. The response I got was neutral, slightly delayed. The issue was resolved without me. Nothing exploded, no one noticed. But inside, something had shifted permanently. I began to see how much of my behavior had been driven by fear masquerading as virtue. Fear of being disliked, fear of being seen as difficult, fear of stepping outside the role that had kept me safe. That fear had cost me years of self-erasure, and I had accepted the cost without negotiating the terms. The rest of the day unfolded normally. I attended meetings, I completed tasks, I smiled at colleagues, but I was no longer inside the same story. I was observing it from a slight distance, noticing patterns without immediately adapting to them. I didn't make a plan that day. I didn't decide to leave. I didn't even tell myself that things would change. All that changed was my internal alignment. I stopped assuming that endurance was the same as strength. That day marked the beginning of something quieter than rebellion. It was the beginning of a choice. From that moment on, my silence wasn't automatic. It was deliberate. And that distinction, subtle as it sounds, changed everything that followed. After that day, I didn't become louder. I didn't assert myself in ways that would have drawn attention. From the outside, nothing about me appeared to change, and that was intentional. What changed was my relationship to silence. Before, silence had been my default, an instinctive response shaped by fear and habit. Now, it has become a decision. I began to notice when I stayed quiet and why. I let pauses exist without rushing to fill them. I stopped preemptively offering solutions to problems that weren't mine to solve. At first, this felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. I had spent so long equating helpfulness with worth that withholding it, even briefly, felt like a violation of my own identity. But I stayed with the discomfort. I watched what happened when I didn't intervene. Most of the time, someone else stepped in, sometimes clumsily, sometimes inefficiently, and sometimes not at all. The system didn't collapse, but it did wobble. Small delays, minor confusion, the kind of friction I had been quietly absorbing for years. No one connected it to me. They couldn't. I hadn't announced anything. I hadn't changed my title or my availability. I was still present, still professional, still doing my assigned work. I had simply stopped protecting the system from its own blind spots. This new silence was misread almost immediately. A colleague commented offhandedly that I seemed less involved lately. Another asked if everything was okay, in a tone that suggested concern but carried an undercurrent of evaluation. I responded calmly. Factually, I was focusing on my priorities. Nothing more. They nodded, they accepted it, and they adjusted their expectations without naming the shift. What fascinated me was how quickly my silence was interpreted as weakness rather than intention. Because I wasn't visibly upset, because I didn't frame my boundaries emotionally, people assumed I had simply receded. That assumption gave me space. I listened more closely in meetings, not for opportunities to contribute, but for information. I paid attention to how decisions were made, who influenced them, and which voices were consistently absent. I noticed how often urgency was manufactured to justify poor planning, how often responsibility flowed downward without accountability following it. I began documenting things, not as evidence for confrontation, but as a way of understanding the system in full. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped intervening in them. I could see where work accumulated, where communication failed, where credit shifted. All of this happened quietly, without announcement. There was a strange relief in no longer performing competence for validation. I still did my job well, but I no longer overfunctioned to compensate for others. I let my work speak for itself, even when that meant it wasn't immediately praised. Fear still surfaced, of course. There were moments when I worried that pulling back would make me irrelevant, that I would be replaced, that my value would diminish. But each time that fear arose, I checked it against reality. I wasn't being punished. I wasn't being excluded. If anything, people seemed slightly unsettled, unsure how to place me now that I wasn't always smoothing edges. That unsettled feeling wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the absence of something they had come to rely on without acknowledging. I realized then that silence, when chosen consciously, has a different weight. It creates space, it invites projection, and it allows you to see how others respond when you stop carrying what was never meant to be yours alone. I didn't correct misunderstandings. I didn't clarify my intentions. I let people believe what they needed to believe. That restraint wasn't passive, it was protective. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be seen or unseen. I was simply present on my own terms. And while no one noticed this shift directly, it set the stage for everything that came next. What they never noticed was how much space their assumptions gave me. They assumed my quiet meant disengagement, that my reduced visibility meant a lack of ambition. That was because I wasn't asserting myself publicly, and I wasn't moving privately. Those assumptions were comfortable for them, and incredibly useful for me. While others filled meetings with opinions, I paid attention to outcomes. I watched which initiatives received resources and which ones stalled. I noticed how often decisions were revisited, reframed, or quietly reversed without acknowledgement. Patterns became clear once I stopped participating emotionally. I began to learn the organization the way you learn a city, not by the map they give you, but by walking its side streets. I tracked informal power, not titles. The person people deferred to when things went wrong. Who controlled timelines without being named as decision makers. who took credit and who absorbed blame. I also started learning outside the boundaries of my role. In the evenings, I read about operational risk, compliance standards, and labor practices, not because I planned to accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but because I wanted to understand the environment I was in. I wanted language for things I had only felt before. I wanted to know where responsibility actually lived when systems failed. I revisited my own work with fresh eyes, not as tasks, but as infrastructure. I documented dependencies. I clarified processes that had previously lived only in my head. I noticed how often my judgment had been substituted for policy. None of this was dramatic. It didn't feel like plotting. It felt like finally seeing clearly. At work, I remained polite and cooperative. I met expectations. I delivered on time. But I stopped volunteering context unless it was requested. I answered questions directly, without cushioning them in reassurance. I allowed others to experience the natural consequences of incomplete information. They never noticed the difference in my behavior. They only noticed small disruptions, missed connections, delayed handoffs, confusion about things that had once just worked. These disruptions were treated as isolated issues. No one traced them back to a single source. I was careful not to create harm. I didn't withhold critical information. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply stopped acting as an invisible translator between broken processes and functional outcomes. In the space that opened up, I positioned myself differently. I updated my records. I clarified ownership boundaries. I asked questions that revealed gaps without offering immediate solutions. I made my work legible in ways it hadn't been before. Documented, traceable, transferable. This wasn't about making myself replaceable. It was about making my contribution undeniable. Outside the organization, I quietly explored options. I reviewed my finances. I updated my resume, not impulsively, but methodically. I reached out to a few trusted contacts, not to complain, but to listen. To understand how other environments worked. To calibrate what was normal and what I had normalized unnecessarily. Each conversation confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My experience wasn't unique, but it wasn't inevitable either. The more information I gathered, the less afraid I felt. Fear thrives in vagueness. Clarity weakens it. At work, people continued to underestimate me in familiar ways. They assumed I was content, that I wasn't going anywhere, that I would always be available to absorb overflow. That assumption allowed me to move without resistance. I wasn't rushing toward an exit. I wasn't counting down days. I was preparing myself to choose from a position of strength rather than fear. For the first time, leaving felt like an option, not a threat. What they never noticed was that my silence had shifted from containment to observation, from self-protection to self-respect. I was no longer waiting to be recognized. I was learning how to recognize when staying no longer made sense. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. The reveal didn't arrive as a surprise. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already been circling the truth for weeks, maybe months. The difference now was that I finally allowed myself to name it without softening the edges. One afternoon, while reviewing documentation I had been organizing, I noticed how many critical processes depended on decisions that were never formally approved, workarounds that had become standard practice, responsibilities that had shifted without a record, exceptions that had quietly become rules. None of this was malicious. That's important to say. It was the result of speed, convenience, and a culture that valued momentum over reflection. But it meant something significant. The system functioned because people like me absorbed ambiguity without insisting on clarity. And I had been doing it for years. I realized then that my leverage wasn't positional. It wasn't about authority or influence. It was structural. I understood how things actually worked, not how they were described. I knew where risk lived, where accountability blurred, where continuity depended on informal knowledge rather than policy. That knowledge didn't make me powerful in a dramatic sense. It made me necessary in ways no one had articulated, and therefore no one had protected. This realization didn't come with satisfaction. There was no sense of victory, only a steady, grounding clarity. I saw that I had two options. Continue as I was, quietly maintaining systems that relied on my discretion while remaining undervalued and exposed. Or change my relationship to that knowledge, to make it visible, transferable, and no longer tied to my silence. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Fear had been loud when I imagined leaving without preparation. Now that I understood the landscape, fear receded. Not because the risk disappeared, but because it was finally defined. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't hint at what I knew. I simply continued documenting, clarifying, aligning my responsibilities with what was formally recognized. Where expectations exceeded my role, I asked for a definition. Where decisions lacked ownership, I requested it. Each request was reasonable. Each one revealed something. Some were met with delay, others with vague assurances. a few with quiet resistance, but none were dismissed outright. The system adjusted just enough to keep moving, without addressing the underlying dependency it had on invisible labor. That was the reveal. I understood then that the organization didn't know how much it relied on people like me because it had never needed to ask. Our silence had been efficient. And I understood something else too. Staying silent indefinitely would mean continuing to subsidize a structure that would never fully see me. There was no bitterness in that realization, just honesty. I reviewed my options again, this time without urgency. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't desperate. I had time, information, and the ability to choose. The leverage wasn't about holding anything hostage. It was about knowing that I could step away without collapse, and that my absence would reveal truths my presence had been concealing. That knowledge didn't make me reckless. It made me careful. I began planning not for impact, but for alignment. I asked myself what kind of work I wanted to do and under what conditions. What kind of environment would I no longer accept? What fears I was willing to outgrow. The reveal wasn't something I shared. It was something I carried quietly, like a compass. It didn't tell me where to go. It told me where I was. And once you know that, pretending otherwise becomes impossible. The decision didn't arrive as a single moment of courage. It arrived as a narrowing. Once I had clarity, the number of choices actually expanded, and then, slowly, contracted again. I could stay and renegotiate. I could push for recognition, formal authority, and a redefinition of my role. I could continue quietly, armed now with knowledge, using it to protect myself better than before. Or I could leave. Each option had logic behind it. Staying felt safer on paper. I knew the systems. I knew the people. I knew how to move without friction. Leaving meant uncertainty, new dynamics, new risks, the possibility of being misunderstood all over again. For a while, I didn't choose. I let the options exist without forcing a conclusion. I wanted to be sure that whatever I did next wasn't a reaction. I had reacted enough in my life, usually by adapting myself smaller. What finally made the decision unavoidable wasn't another act of disrespect. It was something quieter. I was asked to take responsibility for an outcome without being given authority over the process. Again, the request was framed politely, almost casually. We'll need you to make sure this lands. No mention of decision-making power, no acknowledgement of scope. I listened, I nodded, I asked a few clarifying questions. And as I did, I felt something close, not fear, not anger, but recognition. This was the role reasserting itself. The system is correcting for my recent boundaries by pulling me back into familiar shape. In that moment, I understood that staying would require constant resistance, that any progress I made toward visibility would have to be defended repeatedly, that the system would always prefer me quiet, capable, and contained. I went home that evening and sat with that understanding. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't catastrophize. I simply asked myself one question. Do I want to keep proving my worth to a structure that only recognizes it when it's invisible? The answer came without emotion. No, leaving wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of alignment. I reviewed my finances again. I reviewed my options. I'd looked at the timeline realistically. I wasn't running away. I was choosing toward something else, even if I didn't yet know exactly what that was. The irreversible part of the decision wasn't submitting a resignation, it was internal. I stopped imagining a future where staying made sense. Once that door closed in my mind, everything else followed naturally. I didn't announce my intentions. I didn't seek reassurance. I moved quietly, deliberately. Fear still whispered. About instability, about regret, about whether I was overreacting. But fear no longer had the authority to decide for me. I understood then what fear had cost me over the years. Not just opportunities, but self-trust. It had taught me to doubt my own thresholds, to normalize discomfort, to stay longer than necessary. Fear cost me more than quitting ever would. That realization didn't make leaving easy, but it made staying impossible. From that point on, every action I took was shaped by that choice. Even before anyone else knew it had been made. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter. Not externally. I still showed up, still participated, still met expectations. But internally, there was no more debate. The constant low-level negotiation I had been having with myself simply stopped. In its place was a calm focus that surprised me. I didn't announce my plans. I didn't drop hints or wait for someone to ask if I was okay. I understood now that visibility, when misaligned, invites interference. So I moved in silence. I organized my responsibilities carefully. I made sure my documentation was complete, accurate, and accessible. Not to prove anything, but to ensure continuity. I clarified the deliverables. I aligned timelines. Where processes depended on my discretion, I formalized them. Where knowledge lived only in my head, I transferred it deliberately. This wasn't generosity, it was integrity. I wanted to leave without creating chaos, without validating the narrative that I was essential only because I had hoarded information. I refused to let my exit be framed as a disruption. The system had been fragile long before I considered leaving. At the same time, I prepared myself. I had quiet conversations outside the organization, not desperate ones, thoughtful ones. I asked about culture, expectations, and growth paths. I listened more than I spoke. I paid attention to how people described their work. Not just what they said, but what they didn't. I refined my resume with precision. I didn't inflate titles or dramatize impact. I described what I had actually done in language that reflected responsibility rather than obedience. That distinction mattered. At work, people noticed nothing unusual. If anything, they seemed relieved. I was still dependable, still calm, still absorbing less noise without comment. My boundaries were now internal, invisible. There were moments when I felt a strange tenderness toward the place I was preparing to leave. Not nostalgia, exactly. More like compassion. I could see how the system had evolved this way, how incentives shaped behavior. I didn't hate it. I just no longer belonged inside it. Fear resurfaced occasionally, especially in quiet moments. Late at night, early in the morning. Questions about timing, about risk, about whether I should wait just a little longer. But fear no longer felt like a command. It felt like information, something to be acknowledged, not obeyed. I also noticed how differently I moved now. I spoke less, but with more intention. I no longer softened observations to make them easier to hear. I stated facts and let them land. That alone shifted dynamics, even if no one named it. No one noticed because no one was looking. That invisibility, once painful, now worked in my favor. It gave me space to act without commentary, to choose without negotiation. I didn't rush the timeline. I respected my own need for stability, even as I prepared to leave it. This wasn't about escape, it was about transition. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same qualities that had made me easy to overlook, patience, restraint, consistency, now made it possible for me to exit cleanly. By the time the final pieces were in place, the decision felt less like a leap and more like a step I had been walking toward all along. And still no one noticed. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived in fragments. At first it was small things. A missed handoff, a delay that couldn't quite be explained, a meeting that ran longer than usual because someone realized mid-conversation that a detail was missing. One I would normally have anticipated and resolved quietly beforehand. No one mentioned my name, not yet. I noticed the shift before anyone else did because I had lived inside the system long enough to feel when it lost balance. It was like removing a small but essential weight from a structure that had learned to rely on counterpressure. Nothing collapsed, but things stopped aligning automatically. Questions began circulating more often, not directed at me, around me. People asked each other things they used to ask me. They CC'd more stakeholders, added more meetings, and escalated issues that once would have been handled in minutes. There was a subtle change in tone, too, a faint edge of irritation, not at any individual, but at the friction itself. Work that had once felt smooth now required effort. I stayed steady. I answered what was asked of me within the scope of my role. I didn't step in to preempt confusion. I didn't volunteer solutions to problems that hadn't been assigned to me. This wasn't punishment. It was consistency. A manager commented in passing that things felt less streamlined lately. Another joked that they needed to find the missing glue. The language was casual, but the sentiment was real. Something had shifted, and no one could quite name it. I watched all of this with a strange mix of distance and familiarity. This was the system learning what my silence had once concealed, not through accusation or exposure, but through experience. What struck me most was how no one framed the issue as structural. Each problem was treated as isolated, a communication gap here, a planning oversight there. The idea that these were connected, that they had been managed quietly by someone who no longer did that work by default, didn't surface. And I understood why. Admitting that would require acknowledging how much had been taken for granted. As the days passed, the effects accumulated. Small inefficiencies multiplied, decisions took longer, follow-ups increased. There was more visible effort for the same results. Still, no one came to me directly to ask what had changed. That too was revealing. The system was more comfortable struggling collectively than confronting the possibility that it had depended too heavily on invisible labor. It was easier to normalize friction than to re-examine assumptions. I didn't feel vindicated watching this unfold. I felt clear. This wasn't about proving my worth after the fact. It was about witnessing the natural consequences of alignment. I was no longer compensating for gaps that weren't mine to fill, and the system was adjusting accordingly. There were moments when I felt the old reflex, to step in, to smooth things over, to restore equilibrium. Those habits don't disappear overnight. But each time I paused, I reminded myself why I had chosen differently. I wasn't withdrawing out of resentment. I was honoring boundaries I should have set long ago. By the time people began to sense that something was truly off, not just temporarily inconvenient, the realization was still diffuse. No one connected it to a person, only to a feeling that things were harder than they used to be. And that was enough to signal that the consequences had begun. By the time the concern became visible, it was already too late to fix it in the way they wanted. The shift had moved beyond minor friction. What had once been background noise was now interrupting momentum. Projects stalled, decisions looped. People began asking the same questions repeatedly, unaware they were retracing steps that had once been quietly guided. This was when the tone changed. Meetings multiplied, roles were revisited. There was talk of process optimization, of realignment, words that signaled discomfort without admitting cause. I watched as leadership searched for solutions that didn't require reflection. Tools, frameworks, new layers of oversight. None of them addressed the real issue. Someone finally reached out to me directly, not with accusation, but with a kind of careful curiosity. Had I noticed anything different lately? Did I have insight into why certain things felt harder? The question hovered between concern and self-protection. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I spoke about the scope, about clarity, about how responsibilities had shifted over time without formal recognition. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't point fingers. I described patterns. The response was polite, thoughtful even, and non-committal. I could see the calculation happening in real time. How much would it cost to change this? How much effort would it require to restructure something that had worked, at least on the surface, for so long? Too much, it seemed. That was when I understood that the window for repair had already closed. Not because the problems were unsolvable, but because solving them would require acknowledging truths that were inconvenient. It would mean admitting that efficiency had been borrowed from people who were never meant to carry it alone. There was a brief surge of urgency, requests for input, invitations to weigh in, a sudden interest in my perspective that felt less like recognition and more like retrieval, as if something valuable had gone missing and they were hoping it hadn't gone far. But the tone was different now. It wasn't collaborative, it was reactive, and I knew that if I stepped fully back into the role now, it wouldn't be as a respected contributor. It would be a patch. I declined, gently, to reabsorb responsibilities that no longer aligned with my role. I referenced documentation, suggested alternatives, offered support within boundaries. Each response was professional, calm, final. The anxiety in the system became more visible. Deadlines were renegotiated, expectations adjusted downward. People grew frustrated, not with me, but with the inefficiency itself. Regret surfaced, not as an apology, but as hindsight. We should have clarified this earlier. We didn't realize how much depended on that. It used to run more smoothly. Yes, it did. What they didn't say, but I felt clearly, was that we assumed you would always be there. By then, my decision had settled into something unmovable. Not because I was stubborn, but because I could see that staying would mean re-entering the same cycle under a different name. Temporary recognition followed by gradual erasure. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. Too late doesn't always mean impossible. Sometimes it means the cost of fixing something is higher than the system is willing to pay. And when that's the case, the most honest choice is to step away. The panic passed eventually, replaced by adjustment. The organization didn't collapse. It adapted. More slowly, more visibly, with more effort. And I watched that adaptation from a distance, knowing that my presence had once made it unnecessary, and my absence had made it unavoidable. The conversation happened in a small room with the door closed and the lights too bright. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just a meeting placed on my calendar with a neutral subject line and a sense of inevitability attached to it. By then, my resignation was already submitted. The decision had been made. What remained was formality. My manager sat across from me, hands folded, posture careful. The tone was measured, almost gentle. This wasn't an interrogation. It was an attempt at understanding, perhaps even containment. "I want to understand what led you here," he said. I believed him, and that made it easier to be honest without being emotional. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every moment of being overlooked. I didn't describe how tired I had been. None of that would have been useful. Instead, I spoke about alignment, about how my responsibilities had expanded without structure, about how expectations had grown without authority, about how silence had been mistaken for consent. I spoke slowly, calmly. I didn't rush to fill the space when he paused. I let the words sit between us. He listened, nodded, asked clarifying questions. There was no defensiveness, no denial. And yet, I could tell that what I was saying didn't quite fit into the framework he was used to. It wasn't an accusation he could respond to. It was a description of a system he had participated in without fully seeing. At one point, he said, "I didn't realize you felt this way." I believed that too. That was the hardest part. Not that he had known and ignored it, but that the structure itself made my experience easy to miss. My quiet had been convenient. My endurance had been misread as comfort. There was a brief moment, just a flicker, where an alternative was implied. A suggestion that things could change, that my role could be revisited, that there might be room for adjustment. I didn't lean into it, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I knew what it would require of me. To stay would mean becoming an exception in a system that produced the same outcomes repeatedly. It would mean carrying the burden of change alone. I declined gently. I thanked him for the conversation. I acknowledged what had worked. I stayed factual. There was no apology offered, and none requested. Just a mutual recognition that something had been missed, and that recognition had arrived too late to alter the course. When I left the room, I didn't feel drained. I felt light. The confrontation, if it could be called that, had been quiet and contained. No one lost face. No bridges were burned. What stayed with me afterward was how little heat was required to speak the truth once fear was no longer driving the conversation. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded validation. I had simply named what was. And that had been enough. I don't think of that period of my life as a mistake anymore. For a long time I did. I thought of it as wasted time, misplaced loyalty, fear dressed up as responsibility. But distance has a way of softening judgment, not by excusing what happened, but by clarifying what it taught me. Who I am now was shaped by who I was then. I'm still calm, still observant, still measured in how I move through the world. Those traits didn't disappear when I left. What changed is how I relate to them. They are no longer tools for self-erasure. They are choices. I no longer confuse being easy with being valuable. I no longer assume that harmony requires my silence. I understand now that systems reveal their values through what they reward, not what they praise. And I pay attention accordingly. In my current work, I ask questions early. Not aggressively, just clearly. I define boundaries before they're tested. I don't wait for discomfort to accumulate before I name it. And when something feels misaligned, I trust that feeling enough to examine it rather than dismiss it. Fear still exists. It always will, but it no longer gets the final say. I've learned that staying can be just as brave as leaving, and that bravery isn't measured by endurance alone. Sometimes it's measured by the willingness to disappoint expectations that were never fair to begin with. What surprises me most is how little resentment I carry. I don't feel wronged. I feel informed. I can see how easily good intentions and unexamined habits create environments where people like me disappear in plain sight. I also see my own role in that. How often I chose comfort over clarity. How often I made myself small to stay safe. That understanding doesn't make me ashamed. It makes me careful, in the best way. I'm more visible now, not because I demand attention, but because I no longer hide my thinking. I speak when it matters. I pause when it doesn't. I don't rush to prove myself. And perhaps most importantly, I don't stay where my presence is only valued when it's silent. That boundary has become non-negotiable. The version of me who stayed for so long wasn't weak. She was afraid, and fear cost her more than quitting ever would. But she was also learning, quietly, imperfectly, what she would eventually need to know. I carry that version of myself with compassion, not as a warning, but as a reminder of how far I've come. If there's one truth this story keeps returning to, it's this. Silence has a cost. Not the dramatic kind that shows up immediately, but the quiet kind that compounds over time. The kind you don't notice until you look back and realize how much of yourself you've negotiated away in the name of stability. I stayed at a job that broke me because I was afraid to leave, afraid of uncertainty, afraid of regret, afraid that wanting more meant I was ungrateful for what I had. That fear felt responsible, mature, rational. It wasn't. Fear didn't protect me. It delayed clarity. It taught me to normalize discomfort instead of interrogating it. It kept me investing energy into a system that benefited from my silence without ever intending to change it. And the hardest part to accept was this. No one was coming to save me from that. Not because people were cruel, but because systems adapt to what we tolerate. They don't correct themselves out of fairness. They respond to pressure, visibility, and boundaries. When those are absent, the system assumes everything is working. My quiet didn't make me noble. It made me convenient. Leaving wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of self-respect. And it didn't require anger, exposure, or revenge. It required honesty, the kind that begins internally and refuses to keep pretending. Fear cost me more than quitting ever would. It cost me time, confidence, self-trust. It taught me to doubt my own thresholds and to wait for permission that was never going to be offered. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in any part of it, I want to say this gently. Endurance is not the same as strength, and silence is not the same as peace. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop absorbing what was never yours to carry. I don't regret leaving, and I don't regret the years I stayed. Both taught me something essential, but I wish I had understood sooner that fear doesn't disappear by waiting it out. It disappears when you choose differently. So I'll leave you with this question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. What have you been enduring that might actually be asking for a decision? Thank you for listening.